Hello, welcome to Stories with Corrie. We are still going on our journey with the names of God. So if you're just picking up now, feel free to just pick up now. But know that we are kind of glossing over like the Bible to find the names, the moments in time where God reveals different parts of his character or his plan in the different names that he goes by. So kind of like, different phases of my life, I was known as Crazy Corrie, which that's a whole story there, but there you go. There's the point. So with each name comes a story and a little bit more of the revealing of God's purpose and character. So this is following the storyline of Abraham and then Isaac, and then Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob, and we're following Jacob at this point in our story. And so he's running away from his brother Esau because he did him dirty and tricked him out of his inheritance. So Jacob's on the run. He meets God on the way, but then he continues on his journey and winds up in the land where his mother had come from. His mother actually sent him there in hopes that he would find himself a bride. Such a mom trick. She for sure didn't want him marrying any ladies in the area because they were like the worst bunch of pagan ladies. So she sent her son off to her family, and he winds up in this land, and there's a well, and he's this parched and weary traveler with nothing to his name but his walking stick, and he takes a breather, and there's some shepherds there, and he's like, why are you guys here watering your flocks in the middle of the day? This is not the watering time. They're like, we know, but there's a rock, there's a stone on top of the well, and we can't water our flocks until someone rolls it off, and so we're waiting. So Jacob starts waiting with them until he sees this gorgeous shepherdess coming along, and he thought, whoa, I know how to impress her. Whoosh, whoosh. And he rolls off the stone to impress this hot babe rolling up with her sheep, and it worked. Well, it apparently worked. So she rolled up and introduces herself and thanks this gallant savior, and he starts crying. I don't recommend that, but it worked for her. And turns out this girl is his cousin. It's the daughter of his uncle Laban, the man I've been telling you to remember, his mother's brother, Laban. And she says, why don't you come meet my dad? It's going to be great. So he does. He goes and meets Laban, and Laban's so excited to see this long-lost nephew of his and invites him to stay. And so for a month, he just hangs out and falls in love with Rachel, who's beautiful in form and appearance. And then after a month, Laban's like, all right, how about I start paying you? You can't just hang around here. Name your price. And Jacob says, how about your daughter? How about I work to earn her as my bride? And Laban thought for a second and then said, yeah, all right, 7 years. How about that? So Jacob agrees, and after 7 years, what seemed like a day because he was so in love with Rachel, he finally got to marry the girl of his dreams. But he was about to be out-tricked by his uncle, who swapped out the brides, and the next morning after the wedding, he realized he'd married the wrong girl. He'd married her sister, Leah, who the Bible says was soft-eyed and tender-hearted and had the character. She had a great personality, but Jacob wanted the babe. So he goes tramping off to his father-in-law and says, you tricked me. 7 years I worked to marry your daughter Rachel. And what the heck? And Laban says, he could have said this 7 years earlier, but he chooses now to tell Jacob that that's not the way it's done in their culture. The younger daughter has to wait until the older daughter is married. So Jacob was so ticked. You can imagine. And poor Leah, just devastated. Well, Jacob said, all right, how about this? You can marry Rachel in a week, but you have to work 7 more years for me. Jacob was not in a position to argue because he really wanted to marry Rachel and whatever. So he agreed. So 1 week later, he married Rachel. 7 years later, she was officially his. Also 7 years later, he had 11 sons and a daughter. Those girls were busy. His wife, Leah, bore 6 sons and a daughter in 7 years. And then each of them had a handmaid, which they said, hey, why don't you have some kids by them too? Not advisable, but he did. So each of the handmaids had 2 sons of their own. And last but not least, Rachel had a little son named Joseph. So as soon as Joseph was born, Jacob said, all right, I'm done. I can't stand this anymore. Your father is driving me nuts. We're leaving. So he goes to Laban and says, all right, I think we have to go. You're driving me nuts. And Laban says, you can't go. Those are my grandkids. I got to watch them. All right, you name your price and we'll work out a deal. Because that's worked so well in the past. So Jacob says, all right, how about this? I'll take all of your spotted and striped and speckled livestock and they'll be mine. And then that way when you see, you'll know I'm not cheating you because the ones that are speckled are mine and the ones that aren't speckled are yours. And we'll work that out. And Laban said, yeah, that's great. Yep, okay. So Laban took all the spotted and the speckled and the striped livestock, moved a couple days away so that he could have a little space. And due to the Lord's blessing and his sweet shepherding skills and a few breeding tricks, his flocks were prolific. They were growing by leaps and bounds. 6 years later, Laban was getting a little bit annoyed that Jacob was prospering so well, and Jacob was getting a little annoyed that his father-in-law was so OCD and micromanaging and just annoying and had changed his wages 10 times. And so he said, all right, ladies, wives, children, we're leaving. But I know that my father-in-law isn't going to let us go quietly into that good night. So we are going to leave without saying goodbye. So pack your things. We're leaving. We're out. So they did. The girls packed up and the boys were ready for an adventure and they left in the middle of the night. And 3 days later, Laban finds out that his son-in-law had tricked him. These guys tricked him and had run off into the night with his daughters and grandchildren. Laban was ticked. So he tore after Jacob and his family and caught up to them because Jacob was moving at a much slower pace. If you've ever been on a family vacation, you know it's not easy to travel with children and pets and wives. It's very slow going. There were probably a few gift shops along the way too. No, there weren't. So anyways, Laban catches up. He says, where are you going? How dare you? I didn't get to say goodbye to my grandchildren and my daughters. That was so rude. And Jacob said, you want to know what's rude? 20 years I've worked for you and you just keep cheating me for 20 years. I was done. So they have it out for a little bit. And then finally they just said, okay, fine. Let's agree to disagree. Let's make a covenant. Let's build a little pile of rocks. And Laban says, you know what? If you do any harm to me, if you don't treat my girls with respect, and if you don't treat them well, I'm coming for you. And Jacob said, fine. Well, don't cross this line or I'm coming for you. And they part ways. And that's the end of that. Well, Jacob thought, okay, fine. I'm out of the frying pan. But now he was in the fire. Somehow word had gotten to his brother Esau, the very one he'd been running away from 20 years ago, to his brother Esau, that he was on the move. And Esau thought, there's my opportunity. I can finally get my revenge. So he packs up 400 of his military men, because he's now this prominent leader down in the south. So 400 men start marching to the north. And Jacob has a panic attack when he finds out that this is getting real. So he divides up his whole family and his servants and his flocks into 2 different camps and says, well, if one gets attacked, the other one can escape. And if this one gets attacked, at least half will survive. And then he has a little conversation. He prays and says, okay, God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, you said you were going to bless us. You said you were going to make us prosperous like the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea. And you were going to protect us. And really, you've been so faithful. I'm just so unworthy and overwhelmed by your mercies and steadfast love. But can you make sure that my brother doesn't kill me? So that's his prayer, essentially. And then he makes a plan. Of course he does. He's Jacob. He makes a scheme. So he says, okay, how am I going to stop my brother from killing me? And he does this thing that Gandalf does in The Hobbit, where they are, when they get to Baron's house and the hobbits come by the dwarves come by 2 by 2 just to not overwhelm Bjorn. It's the same thing. Same thing. Jacob sends, he's like, okay, first I gotta get some gifts. So he gets like hundreds of sheep and camels and donkeys and goats and oxen and says, okay, we're gonna give these to Esau. Maybe that'll appease him, but let's like go in phases. So we'll divide up into different droves and we'll go in phases. Okay, so you go cut him off at the pass and then wait for it. Okay, now you guys go and overwhelm him with your gifts. So we did this like, I don't know, like 10 times, phase after phase of like droves that were going to cut Esau off and sort of appease him and kind of butter him up and schmooze him before he interacted with Jacob. That was the plan. So then Jacob gets his family across the river and he's awaiting this impending doom, and he has the longest night of his life, knowing that the next day would bring this encounter, and who knows. But that night, a man showed up in the camp. Remember, Jacob was like all by himself, and this dude shows up, and they have this wrestling match. It's so random. They have this wrestling match, and Jacob, he might be a shepherd, but he is scrappy, and remember, he can lift off a rock off of a well anytime a hot girl's in company. So he has this wrestling match, and this stranger is no match for this scrappy shepherd and winds up pinned. And he's like, let me go. And Jacob's like, nope, I'm not letting you go until you bless me. This guy, he's obsessed with blessings. And the guy says, well, first the guy doesn't really answer. He just dislocates Jacob's hip from his socket, and he walks the limp the rest of his life because of it. But it wasn't enough. It didn't deter Jacob. He still has this guy pinned down. He says, I am not letting you go. And the guy says, you know what? What's your name? And Jacob's like, my name is Jacob. And the guy says, you know what? Your name is no longer going to be Jacob. Your name is going to be Israel, because you have striven with God. And he leaves. And Jacob's like, oh my gosh, I've been wrestling with God this whole night and I've survived. So he makes this like altar there and kind of has this moment of like, whoa, I just survived an interaction face to face with God. Holy cow. I mean, how many times does this guy have to interact with God to get it? Anyways, the next day, sure enough, there on the horizon, Esau and his army are looming, and Jacob's, ready for the inevitable death. Death is on the line. Well, he divides up his family. He puts the handmaids and their 4 boys in the front, and then followed by Leah and her 7 children, followed by Rachel and her little toddler son, Joseph, and not toddler, I guess he's like first grade. And Jacob takes the lead, and he intercepts Esau, and Esau started crying. He started crying. What is it with these brothers and their tender, bleeding hearts? So he starts crying, and he's like, oh my gosh, my long-lost brother, it's just so good to see you. What's with all these, who are all those guys? And you see these like little kids tramping behind Jacob. He's like, oh, those are my kids and my wives that the Lord has blessed me with. And, that blessing I stole from you. Sorry about that. And then Esau was like, what was with all those gifts you were sending? What was that all about? And Jacob said, well, I just thought you might want some sheep. I mean, God has just blessed me so much. I mean, not to brag or anything, but I thought you just might want some sheep and some goats and some camels and some donkeys and some, I don't, thought you might like it. And Esau was like, no, I couldn't possibly take that from you. And Jacob said, no, seriously, I need you to take that. I need you to. Esau said, well, all right, if you insist. So they have this little conversation and, swap pleasantries. And then Esau said, hey, how about you follow me back to my home country and we could be neighbors? Wouldn't that be fun? Just follow me. I'll show you the way. Me and my 400 warriors. And Jacob said, oh my gosh, I would love that. But you know what? You go ahead, because I have like kids and wives and sheep. And if I push them too hard, they'll like die in a day. So, you go ahead and we'll catch up. How about that? I can't wait. Let's have coffee when we get there, okay? So that was the plan. And Esau was satisfied. And so he left and he went back to his home and was probably fully expecting Jacob to follow. And Jacob said, yeah, we're not following Esau. We would die. So he takes another way. The trickster again, tricking all the time. So he goes off another way and into the land of Shechem, and he buys some land and pitches a tent and builds an altar, and it's there that he calls upon God, and he calls this altar El-Elohe-Israel. I don't know if I said that right, but we're going to go with it. But it means God, the God of Israel. And I think it's significant. I think it's significant because up until this point, he's like 90 years old at this point. Up until now, every single time, Jacob has always called God the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the fear of Isaac, like the God of my father, like his great-great-grandfather, Nahor. Like, it was never my God. It was never his fear. It was never his faith. And for as many times as he physically interacted with God, you would think he would have gotten it by now. But up until now, every single time he calls God the God of my father or the God of Isaac. It's never the God of Jacob until this moment when he calls him God, the God of Israel, his new name, the guy that strives with God. He's like, yeah, it's been rough. I've been kind of an idiot, to be honest. How many times have I sneaked and tricked and connived, and at what cost? So at this point, from here on out, this is my God. He built an altar and called it that, the God of Israel. I think that's significant because from here on out, this is kind of the default name of God, because from here on out, we pretty much exclusively are following his line and his family, but it is really significant. God, the God of Israel. So here's my thought for you, whoever you are listening. Have you made this God your God? Have you at some point in your life, maybe you didn't, purchase a land, set up a tent, and build an altar, but at some point said, you know what, this isn't just the God of my father or the God of my grandma. This isn't just the God of my culture or my school. This isn't just somebody else's faith. This is my faith. And I'm going to follow. I'm going to stop striving. I'm going to stop struggling. I'm going to stop trying to do it my way because it's just going to end in disaster and regret, possibly for generations. I am going to call on my God. This is my faith. And I'm going to pursue it with abandon. And I want everyone to know this isn't just, I'm not just going along to get along. I'm just going along so I can get an A in this, theological class I'm in. I'm not going to, this is my God. That's a thought, something to think about. Because I know some of us tend to just, go along to get along and say, well, I mean, my parents go to church, so I go to church. Yeah, I guess I'm Christian because, my family is Christian. So I guess. Doesn't do you any good until it's your faith. Okay? Just because your parents wearing a parachute when you jump out of a plane doesn't mean you're going to not die if you don't have one on yourself. May not be the best analogy, but there you go. Strap on that faith yourself, claim this God as your own, and live it out so that everyone in the area for generations to come will know that this God is your God as well. Well, there you go. There you go. God, the God of Israel. The next story will continue the story of Israel and his many children. And we might have to gloss over some stuff to get to the next names of God, but it's going to be a jackpot the next time, I think. So stay tuned. Let me know what you think. Tell me your story. When did you make this God, the God of insert name, your God? Tell me your story. I'd love to hear it. Love to hear what you're thinking. Like and subscribe. And see you next time on Stories with Corrie.